Okay, welcome back, everybody. SJJMAS number 25. It's one that I've been waiting for a while. We've got serial blogger, LA-based, Orthodox Jew, alt-right adjacent, man in the middle of this weird movement that we all talk about regularly on this channel. It's Luke Ford. Thanks for coming, Luke. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for allowing me to be a part of these important conversations that will forever shift the direction of Western civilization.
Well, Luke, people have described SJJMAS as the light that shines in the darkness in the middle of winter. Gets them through.
That's what they're saying.
Yes, that's what the public out there are saying. It's the average sentiment. So, Luke, for anybody who doesn't know, I probably graduated YouTube via the school of Luke Ford, okay? Hands up. This is kind of how I came through onto the internet. So I have said in the past that I kind of owe my, I don't know, sensibleness in a weird way to watching Luke Ford shows back in the day and seeing the self-destruction of many characters along the way that Luke's covered. Luke has done more interviews of alt-right characters single-handedly than anybody that I can think of, probably. So, Luke, what first attracted you to this alt-right space? I know it was a more innocent time back in the day. Let's say pre-Trump. What first attracted you to this thing in the first place?
Well, I read the bell curve in 1997, and it immediately struck me as basic common sense. And the denial of it was denial of reality. And I was also somewhat of an online entrepreneur in that I was looking for a niche where there was room to say something. And so I was primarily making my living blogging about the pornography industry because there weren't any serious reporters reporting on the pornography industry. And I saw that the topic of group differences was just a wide open space that virtually no respectable person was going to risk their social standing and their professional standing on this topic. And so I thought, wow, this is wide open. And so I'd explore it somewhat when I was talking about the pornography. But I was also interested in just talking about those things that you're not supposed to talk about, but are obviously true. And group differences was one of those. And so since 1997, the obvious truth of group differences has been, now, you can discuss group differences in a way that's just really nasty and that will create considerable turmoil and opposition. But you can also do it in a way that most people can recognize that you're just primarily interested in talking about what's true instead of trying to hurt people. And so the alt-right started talking about group differences. Well, and that was a foundation. Richard Spencer said that race is a central part of identity for many people, and it is. For some people, it's the number one thing. For other people, it might be the number four thing, but it's certainly an important part of identity for many people. And just recognizing that different groups have different gifts, and the opening up of the Overton window with the alt-right, I thought was initially a good thing. But I think Colin Liddell was right when the alt-right shifted from primarily being a written word-based medium to a podcasting medium, that the average IQ of both the audience and the people who are pushing the movement forward dropped considerably. And then it just self-destructed beginning in late 2016 with Richard Spencer trying to take the movement in a more overtly Nazi direction. I never considered myself part of the alt-right. I'm Jewish and never tried to hide that, but it was an amusing and entertaining and provocative space for a couple of years before it self-destructed.
Yes, from my looking at it from like a distance now, looking back, I try to say that there are like specific periods of it. There's pre-Trump alt-right, and that was like the big tent alt-right. The parts where like Ramsey Paul was involved, and whatever, all the characters that were all in this big tent up until like Trump, and then Hailgate happened, and lots of people jumped off the bandwagon. Then there was Charlottesville, at the end of 2017, I think, August 2017. But you were still involved post Charlottesville. In fact, as I remember, not involved, sorry, I don't wish to miscategorize Luke as being involved in the alt-right. He was very much adjacent, very much journalistic, commentating upon it, looking from, the sidelines at this interesting space going on. But what I'm trying to point at is that the summer of 2018 is when you had your most popular shows, from my recollection. It started in January the 4th, 2018, with that famous interview between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer on Andy Warski. And from that, a series of Luke Ford interviews with various characters on the dissident right happened. Looking back upon that period of time, who do you think was the main players within the dissident right that you thought had some substance to add to the conversation, Luke?
Richard Spencer had some substance. He was obviously highly educated and highly intelligent. I gave the alt-right more credit for intellectual substance than it turned out to have, and the dividing line was the Coffness critique. So Nathan Coffness has published his critique in something like April of 2018, and nobody in the alt-right responded on the basis of its facts and logic. Nobody took it seriously. There were a lot of aspersions cast, and there were a lot of put downs delivered, but no one really engaged with the substance of it. I thought that Kevin McDonald's response to it was weak. I thought that the responses published on Countercurrents were weak. I thought that Andrew Joyce's responses on Twitter were weak. American Renaissance didn't take it seriously. And so that's when the blinds fell from my eyes with regard to the amount of intellectual substance on the alt-right. I had an exaggerated sense of the substance behind it, and there may indeed have been more substance behind it, but people followed their audience capture, and so they avoided tackling things that were inconvenient, such as the Coffness critique. And so the movement perhaps had more possibility. Right now we look at it as inevitably a shambles, but the movement probably had more possibility than it finally exhibited, because it chose to be captured by its. No one person embodies truth, but if we were to pick one person who embodies truth about the pursuit of truth with regard to group differences, I'd say it'd be Steve Saylor. And when much of the alt-right turned on Steve Saylor, Nick Fuentes turned on Steve Saylor, you were just seeing the intellectual bankruptcy of the movement, and the lack of historical knowledge, and just the unwillingness to confront the audience. So I had my Luke versus the audience moments with regard to COVID. So I had a more open mind to what repressive measures public health and political figures were taking with regard to COVID. And I wasn't on board cheering, but I wasn't on board saying, this is terrible, this is absolutely ridiculous, there's absolutely no factual basis for this. I was just in the middle saying, had some sympathy for both sides. And the way that virtually the entire dissident right, except for Steve Saylor, turned on social distancing, turned on the case for vaccines, turned on the case for wearing masks in indoor spaces, to me, that was a sign of the intellectual bankruptcy of the movement. So I think what happens is that people realize that there are group differences and that they've been lied to in that regard, and then they extract
Luke, your mic just cut out.
Well, here's the
you're
problem.
back.
People go from thinking that, well, obviously there are group differences. So everything that I've been told by professors and by the news media is a lie. And then they extrapolate from that to everything that I'm being told is a lie. And that's not true, right? There's no one person who's going to embody the truth, but to automatically assume that anyone who has power or is telling you a lie, or that the elites are always lying to you, that's false too. And I think a lot of people found it convenient once they discovered that, there are group differences, we're being lied to then extrapolate, well, they're lying about the moon landing as well. They're lying about the Earth revolving around the sun, and they're lying about COVID. And I think that's where people started really going off course.
Yeah. I'm never quite sure to what extent all the conspiracy theory stuff in the DR is like an attempt to just bring in that community into our talking points. I know that there is some aspect of that. There's like characters like the Paranormies and weird characters who just run conspiracy theory shows, and I'm aware that their modus operandi is that this community is a massive like demographic, and we can like bring them into our ideas through like engaging with them. And so some people caught this stuff maybe like not seriously, and so they bring it in, but it definitely contributed to what I would call like the Tucker qualification of the dissident right 2020 onwards. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a minor factor. I think it's more that people discover something and then believe in it way too much. So if the best analogy I can come up with is if you were raised in a religion, right, you believed that religion was ultimate truth, right? I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist until I was about 14. I had no doubt that Seventh-day Adventism was the most profound revelation of God's will to humanity. And that shaped my early years. And so if you believe in that, or if you really believe in something, then you become blind, right? When you form ties with people, you also become blind. So yes. I convert to Judaism, and I form ties with Jews, and I become blind to critiques of Jews for many years. I just always assumed that Jews were the righteous one. Any conflict between Jews as a group and non-Jews, I just automatically assumed that Jews would be in the right. And once you form any kind of bond, I think it primarily comes down to your bonds with people, even if they're online bonds. Like if you find, this is my tribe, these hilarious people on the alt-right, then you just assume that they've got it, and that they're always right. And I think that's a major mistake. So let me try to go back to your theory, was that it was a deliberate, calculated strategy by members of the dissident right to reach out to conspiracy theorists and to show empathy for them, because we've been lied to on so many occasions. If
I could add, I know Red Ice definitely did this. If you remember, they were like conspiracy theorists, and then they tried to bring that crowd into explicit white nationalism, basically. So,
okay, so it probably may well be, but then there's so many problems when you deliberately choose a moronic crowd to be your audience. There are just so many dangers with that, and when you see people going off and doing horrible things like murder, like Luigi Mangione, or people going off half-cocked, you have the Saudi doctor mowing down this Christmas crowd, and then you had this triple murderer showing up at Nick Fuentes' house last week. So yes. Some people are vulnerable, and there's something that you can say if you catch them at a particular moment of vulnerability, and you have built up some kind of, say, parasocial bond with them, that can lead them on in a direction. And so I become much more discriminating and much more careful in the things I say, because I see so many people influenced by personalities online, and then they go off in a terribly destructive direction. And so I've deliberately tried to cultivate the opposite of the moron crowd. So I try to cultivate an intelligent, discriminating, thoughtful, pro-social following, and I would rather have that 5% of my former audience than the larger audience that I had, which was often high school dropouts and people intent on self-destruction. And they provided tremendous, compelling, spectacular content on my show that was often touching on important truths, but they were immolating. They were burning up their own lives in the process, and that was just too painful to me to think that I was not responsible for them self-destructing on my show, because they would have self-destructed on some other online platform if they hadn't done it on my show. But to the extent that I played a 2% role in facilitating their self-destruction, I just wanted no part of that. So it used to be anyone was welcome on my show, and now 1% of people who want to come on my show are welcome, because of the enormous amount of self-destruction, including from people who have tenured positions, people who are married, people who have kids, people who have PhDs, and then they would just self-destruct online. And so the capacity of my potential audience for self-destruction online was much more profound and vast and wider and deeper than I thought initially.
Yeah, so if people aren't aware, Luke, as well as an interview show, ran a platform where there would be, I mainly remember it as every Sunday, you would have this cast of characters that would turn up one by one, from Claire Core all the way up to even in the like culminating days of Nick Fuentes and Baked Alaska and the Jim Goad show, where they all like, I think you actually left the show. You walked away for like an hour or something and just left them to it.
I'd walk away for 5 hours, 6 hours. A friend flew in from Australia, and I walked away for 6 hours. And people would just, I'd check in like every hour, but I didn't have the ability to end the show. I would just check in, and people were just going back and forth. And I'd walk away for 20 minutes. I'd walk away for an hour. I'd walk away for 6 hours, and just allow people to have a discussion on my channel.
Yeah, those were really the heady days of the alt-right. And this was the summer of 2018 from my recollection. So when I was looking at the dates, I was surprised that this was actually all post Charlottesville. Because in my mind, I'd had that Charlottesville was when everything went wrong. But I think for you, Luke, didn't it all really start to go wrong in your mind? And when you changed, it was that Tree of Life synagogue shooting, wasn't it? In August 2018. Oh, have I got it wrong?
That was profound. I mean, I will admit that I, as a convert to Orthodox Judaism, that most of my friends are Orthodox Jews, that hit me in a way that I would not expect it to hit someone who's not Jewish. But it went wrong with the Kaufman's critique, which I believe came out in March of 2018, and the inadequacy of the response to that showed me a movement that was much more intellectually bankrupt than I thought. And I just wanted to reinforce a point that you'd made earlier. I never felt any identification with the alt-right, just as I didn't feel any identification with the pornography industry. I wrote about the pornography industry from 1995 to 2007. It was the primary topic that I wrote about for those 12 years. It was my primary source of income, was writing on this industry, but I never felt a part of the industry. I was just reporting on it. But that's not how it's received by normies, right? People think that if you primarily report on one topic, that then you're a part of the industry that you report on. So it was always very clear in my mind that there was me, and then there was the alt-right going on outside of me. There was me, then there was the pornography industry operating outside of me. But the way that is received in the normie mind is that I would be I would be understood as part of the industry that I was covering.
Yeah, it's interesting that you can make the distinction in your mind, but to others, yes, you are part of it. In a weird way, even I have like become part of it in such a micro way. Like, I'm doing these streams, I'm talking to you, I'm talking about the cast of characters. I've like self-inserted myself into it. And for a time, Luke, your show was part of the alt-right space, at least for people like myself, for Brundlefly, for Clarecore, for all these characters. So in a way, we become drawn into the things that we speak about. They become part of us, whether we like it or not. To what extent do you think that the things like that we participate in, even if we try to remain aloof, like corrupt us, and we are drawn into them?
It depends. So it primarily comes down to the nature of the individual himself. I don't think it's inevitable that you become corrupted by the group that you cover. Many people specialize in terrorism, and they don't become terrorists or part of terrorism, and it's also not linked together in the public mind. So here's what was going on in my heart and soul and mind. I'd become ill with some kind of mysterious ailment in February of 1988, where I'd gone from a person who was capable of doing 1,300 push-ups and 120 pull-ups in 30 minutes to someone who could no longer run a mile without getting sick. And it just basically happened overnight. It was a mysterious ailment that forced me to essentially spend about 20 hours a day in bed. And when I managed to make 2/3 of recovery from this after 6 years of illness, I knew during my illness that there was a solution out there in the world. I just needed to access it. I just needed to find it. And I had no confidence that I could find it on my own or that my family could find it. So when I was ill, I deliberately placed a whole bunch of singles ads and tried to connect with women because I knew that I would have the ability to strongly connect with at least one woman who would then make it important to her to find a solution for me to get out of this mess. And so I connected with one woman who took me to her psychiatrist, who got me on a medication called Nardil at the end of 1993. And within a couple of months, I moved from a bedridden state to 2/3 of normal. And so this was a strategy that worked. You could criticize it on moral grounds that I was, using these women. I was sleeping with women, hoping they'd help me find a way out of this problem. And then by 1995, I still have this idea that there's a solution for what ails me that is out there, but I can't access it on my own. I have no confidence that the current group around me and my family around me will be able to access it. So if there'd been a cult that would have enabled me to find the solution to this health problem, I very likely would have joined the cult. So I developed a conviction in the summer of 1995 that I just needed to become famous. If I became famous, that then my problem would receive some notice and someone out there would become invested and send me a solution. And so I read a book on how to become famous, and it said 2 main paths: give something away or write a book. And so I decided, well, I'll write a book. So I published a book on the history of sex in film. And then that led to a website. And I enjoyed having 10,000 to 15,000 readers every day. And people would send me suggestions for my health problem that I would mention on my website. So the more readers I had, the more chance I had of finding some kind of solution to my health problem. And I also probably took this into my streaming on the alt-right. I had a considerable personal investment in my own welfare and trying to maximize my audience. And so that was a large part of the reason I wanted the biggest audience as possible, so that I increased the chances that somebody out there would tell me, what was ailing me. And then eventually I stumbled onto the problem myself just from an Amazon suggestion. I started taking beef organ capsules 3 years ago, and I finally went and got diagnosed for ADHD and medicated for it a little over a year ago. So my 2 primary physical physiological problems were dealt with right there. And so I no longer needed a large audience. But I did deliberately turn away from the big audience strategy after I left streaming with Kevin Michael Grace. So that was in February of 2020. And so I shifted towards a much more nuanced, small audience show. So I guess I'd given up on the big audience strategy then to instead deliver a show for a more discriminating and a much more narrow audience, but one that I could then feel really good about. I didn't feel good when people would come on my show and self-destruct. So that was a long, meandering response to, I forget what question.
No, these are very interesting insights into your personal character. I'm often fascinated by what makes people jump from being an anon in a chat, just following the movement, a consumer, to then a creator. And then when they start doing this, are they doing it in earnest because they care about like the topics that they're talking about? So on the alt-right, they care about group differences. They believe that like their group is deracinated, being, given an unfair ride. Things can be changed by their actions, or if they are self-serving, if they're doing it for their own interest. And I'm more and more concerned that people are doing it in the social media age for their own like self-aggrandizement and their own monetization, definitely. To what extent do you think
can we follow up on that?
Absolutely.
So I think most people who do what we're doing right now are self-destructing, that this is against their interest almost as much as being in porn. So a lot of people get into the pornography industry because the attention that they receive fills the hole that they have from not having genuine connection with other people. So the fame meets their temporary need for love and connection. And there is, I think, the same dynamic going on with live streaming. Would you agree with me that most people who live stream on the topics that we talk about are self-destructing? Or what percentage? I would say 90% self-destructing by live streaming on these topics. What would be your estimate?
It's an interesting question because I think people used to self-destruct a lot more than now. You get characters now who make themselves through this. I'm thinking like Aaron McIntyre, these characters who successfully create a channel, they play the game well, they monetize, they end up on the blaze. These characters, for some people, it's been a golden goose. For others, and I'm thinking like, I don't know, 2021, 2022, it was like 95% self-destructive. Now we're in an age where people are crafting the game. They seem to be aware, much more savvy about how to play the game, and are just doing it to build a social media presence. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but people's intentions don't necessarily have anything to do with what's really right for them or to their advantage. Yeah, they're trying to craft and play a game, but are they fulfilling their own genuine interests, or are they self-destructing? So you didn't give me a percentage. Do you have a guess? Do you think most people who do what we're doing are self-destructing, or do you think most people who do what we're doing are acting in their own self-interest? I would wager to you, I would put it to you, sir, that 90% of the people who are doing what we are doing are self-destructing. And if I'm wrong on that estimate, I am wrong in the underestimation side of it. It may be 99%.
Wow, that's huge. I'd have gone lower. I'd have said maybe 75%, because I'm adding in now that today censorship has reduced. We've gotten over the censorship hump. So there is definitely much more. It depends what we class as self-destruction, Luke, because you can, I guess, self-destruct in terms of your reputation, but still get monetized, still create a successful platform, and do relatively well in your life. If you don't mind being known as that edgy guy online, if that doesn't negatively impact your life. Now, you might say it can't not negatively impact your life, but so my explanation is we've got over the censorship hump. You can now have a platform somewhere because there's the alternative space available. If they won't have you on YouTube, you can do a Rumble. You can make money on X. There's much more opportunity now for edgy people to cultivate an edgy audience and make a success of it. Not necessarily as a good thing.
What percentage of attractive young women who become OnlyFans models and porn stars would you say are acting against their own best interests? I would say 99%. How about you?
Sure, yes. From what I understand, the ones who make a living from it are in the 1%. Yeah.
Okay, so let's say someone makes $50,000, or let's say they make $150,000 a year from live streaming edgy, dissident right content, and that comes at the expense of good relations with their family, that they lose most of their friends, and it makes it difficult for them to hold a normal job going forward. To me, that is self-destruction, even if they're making $150,000 a year.
Sure, but I'll be honest with you, I'd probably take it.
Right. You would take it because you don't have that much to lose.
Right. Okay, yeah. And I've never seen that amount of money, so it looks attractive to me. I'm not trying for it, obviously, because I don't go ahead and do that. You know, I could have gone edgy and started doing edgy content, but I'm not doing
right.
that.
So you have to think 5 years, 10 years down the road, and you also have to think, how will this affect my interactions with strangers who've simply heard about me in the grossest way possible? So, for example, there is a principle that you shouldn't disclose to your coworkers anything that you would not like them to gossip about. So if you would feel insecure if your coworkers were gossiping about you having ADHD, then don't disclose that to your coworkers. And so if you're an edgy right-wing streamer, all right, you're going to be portrayed in the news media as neo-Nazi. And so how's that going to affect your interaction? For example, will it increase the odds that someone who's just committed a triple murder will show up at your door? It will dramatically increase the odds that someone who's a murderer will show up at your door.
Yeah, that's crazy. By the way, this what's just happened with Nick Fuentes. I mean, maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. Look, I agree with you. I agree with everything that you said, 100%. Don't you think that people can do it and stay anonymous and, you know, keep it online, keep it out of their real lives?
Not generally. Usually people will be outed. So how many prominent dissident right anonymous accounts have become doxxed? Like virtually all of them.
Yes.
Right. Very few people can sustain. It would be hard to think of a dissident right figure more respected than Steve Saylor, and he regrets operating under his real name. So he regrets the choice that he made, and I think he would be deluded to think that would have been able to maintain his anonymity. So Steve Saylor has about as much above ground success as a member of the dissident right could hope to have, and he regrets his choices. So
yes.
Charles Murray went into a depression for 6 months after the brutal reaction to the bell curve, and he tremendously suffered for that book. So I think very few people are suited for a life of social ostracism, because in our evolutionary history, social ostracism meant early death. In all likelihood, you were going to die much earlier and have less success reproducing if you were socially ostracized. So I think for at least 99% of people, social ostracism is a terrible choice that we would do well to minimize the chances.
Yeah, what would you say to somebody like Miami Virtue in the chat here? Raises a good point. He says many of the issues raised by low-status online right types in 2016 are now at the centre of the culture, all redescribed to fit a safer narrative, but not absence and influence and the drive of will. So for all their faults and everything, they've had an impact on the culture. The culture has shifted. You know, we went through the crisis of the alt-right, but we're out here on the other side, and somehow everything that all those people were doing has ended up, affecting the mainstream somewhat. You'd agree that the alt-right had an effect, wouldn't you?
Yes, it had an effect. It seemed to primarily have an effect in the opposite direction, that we got more speech restriction during Donald Trump's first presidency. So there was such an enormous blowback to Charlottesville and other alt-right acts of terrorism that it seemed to make it even more difficult to hold any view that was even adjacent to the alt-right. So from my understanding of reality, when people go out and commit terror using empirically justifiable, logically justifiable arguments as a respectable person with things to lose in your social standing, you can't repeat those same arguments, at least with the same language that the terrorists use. They then make many of their arguments much more difficult to make in polite society. So I both grant the assertion and simultaneously raise a contrary assertion that the alt-right made it more difficult to raise these questions, which would inevitably have to be discussed. So let's say there was never an alt-right. Would we not be talking about pretty much all the same issues that we're talking about now? Because reality in the final analysis will not be denied. And if there'd never been an alt-right, we would still have a politics focused on identity and on nationalism and on immigration restriction. I both see the argument, the truth of the argument that you raised, and I also see the negation of the argument that was raised. And so if you force me to choose between those two alternatives, I would reluctantly perhaps choose the negation. So I know that sounds incredibly wishy-washy, but the law of gravity will not be repealed, and reality will not be denied, and reality forces a preoccupation with issues of immigration, for example. And so if there'd never been this edgy, comedic alt-right movement, immigration would still be at the core of Western politics.
I don't know if I agree with you. I think that we were entering this period in 2013, 2014. Do you remember SJWism was like at its peak? I remember Sargon of Akkad, who started railing in 2024 about the SJWs and all this kind of stuff, and he would sit there, play their videos, Anita Sarkeesian's video, and pound at the screen. And this was like, because it was at its absolute peak then, and without like some kind of pushback, without it being made okay. This is what attracted me, by the way, to the alt-right, was somebody out there just like breaking through that wall and saying it's okay to not feel like all this political correctness is normal, to that it's okay to recognize differences, that it's okay to realize that they're like these blue-haired screaming feminists are crazy, that they don't represent how you feel, in your own mind about things. And so I do think it was some kind of, I do think it had an effect. How much of it do you think was done in earnest, though? How much do you think people believed in it, and how much do you think people like just used it for their own gain and corrupted it and ruined it?
Okay, so that's great. That goes down to a question of first principles, and I side with with Tom Wolfe, who sides with this or that German sociologist, who argues that after our basic needs are met, our biggest need is for status, and so after our survival needs are met, would you agree, or would you if not agree that status is our primary driver, that it's certainly in the top three after our basic needs are met?
Yes, I would definitely.
Okay, so I just find it an incredibly useful explanatory factor for why almost anyone does anything. They want more status. And most of the people who spend a great deal of time online, including myself, are doing it because we feel like we can achieve more status online than we achieve in the real world. And so I think what's driving most online posting is the desire for status. And that's for the people who are posting videos of their pets, and people who are posting videos of what they're eating, and people who are posting comments about politics. It's all primarily driven by status, particularly status within a particular social group that people want to be seen as, a leading member of.
Sure. I suppose that would be a damning indictment of all the online commentary then, really, if we believe that everybody's just out for their own ends. Do you think any good can come of this, even if people are just out for their own self-service?
Yes, and I don't think it's a damning indictment, because the people who are fighting the alt-right are also primarily doing it for status, I would suspect. Right? You can't say these things definitively, but if you simply raise that as a question, then you can look at individuals and see if that fits a pattern. So, for example, my father had, I believe he told me he tested with an IQ of 137. And my father got 2 PhDs. He got one in rhetoric and one in New Testament studies. And he was a highly accomplished Christian evangelist. And he also had some standing as a scholar. And so my father would enjoy buying scholarly books, primarily, is my estimation, to see how often they cited his work. And so there was no other career that my father could have gone into that would give him as much status as being a Christian evangelist. My father could have succeeded in many different careers, but Christian evangelist was the number one thing. Now, that was not how my father experienced his professional life. He believed that he was saving souls and that he was helping people lead a better life, and that was a component. And think about Dennis Prager, again, someone with a very high verbal IQ, incredibly gifted at making persuasive arguments. But there is no other career that Dennis Prager could have gone into than a career as a self-styled moralist, teaching people the difference between right and wrong. There's nothing else that Dennis Prager could have done that would have given him as much status as the particular career path that he chose. Now, this doesn't invalidate their choices. It doesn't mean it's bunk. The people who are fighting the alt-right are also driven by status. The question comes, when are they ever willing to sacrifice status for something higher than their own status? So for me, I consciously strive to optimize for truth. And so I am willing to do shows that get 5 live viewers instead of 3,000 live viewers, because I'm optimizing for truth and I'm saying something that my audience doesn't want to hear. And so when you see figures who put something higher than their status, put more of a value perhaps on truth or on the social good or on their religion. So if Nick Fuentes really was a Christian, you would see him making sacrifices for his Christianity. You would see him saying, boy, I really wish I could make the following joke, or I wish that I could make the following argument, or I really wish that I could do the following things, but my Christianity prevents me from doing these things that I really want to do. So if you truly take your religion seriously, or you truly take optimizing for truth seriously, you will have to make sacrifices to that end. If you don't see people making sacrifices for something higher than their own advancement and status, then it's fair to say that they're primarily just out for their own status. But many people do make substantial sacrifices. So the congressman who ran against Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, he knew that would be the end of his political career. He was mocked by the news media. He was ostracized by the Democratic Party. Dean Phillips, I believe, was his name. But he was right? He was willing to risk social ostracism because he optimized for the truth that Joe Biden was not fit for a second term. And he paid a tremendous price for optimizing for truth. So he should be given credit for optimizing for something greater than his own status.
Yeah, you know what I think it is, Luke? I think a lot of people in these movements associate their own status with achieving the greater good. So when they look, I guarantee, well, I don't guarantee you, but I highly suspect that somebody like Nick Fuentes, for instance, believes that the elevation of my own status equals good for the movement. That it
Yes.
is dependent upon my success. I must elevate myself above everything else to get my message out there. And that it's one and the same thing. So to what extent do you think people become high on their own supply, basically?
Almost everyone, because how many people do you know who sacrifice their status for something higher? So when you encounter someone like Claire Core, who just wrote in the chat, let's face it, boys, I'm the only one with a solution. You're dealing with someone who's deeply deluded, and anyone who thinks that my success equals is the measure of the success of this particular moral project is deeply deluded. So that's someone who's high on their own supply, and that's almost everyone in this space. Almost everyone in this space is high on their own supply in that they equate their own personal status and success with the status and success of their own political, cultural, and national project.
So is there anybody who you can see who you think is critical to, at the moment, to the success of, like, us reasserting a nominally right-wing change or effect upon, like, the cultural space, and the political space? Is there anybody who you see at the moment as being, so important that you'd say, we need to not lose these people?
Nathan Kofnas, who's a friend, and Steve Saylor. Those are the two that jump to mind. And Charles Murray has been a formidable figure in this area. And then the people that Kofnas and Saylor cite admirably. I don't remember the names, but those are the two. None of the other primary figures in the dissident right sphere come to mind. Steve Saylor strikes me as a bloke who's willing to say unpopular things. He took a pretty conventional approach with regard to COVID and alienated most of his audience. And so Steve Saylor is someone who's willing to say what he believes to be true. And I think that's admirable. I can't think of anyone else. So, I mean, Richard Hanania is an incredibly bright man, incredibly gifted man. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He's got a law degree, I believe, from UCLA. But he is so much enthralled to his own ego. So he reads one book and he's convinced that William Shakespeare didn't write his plays. He's convinced that he writes as well as William Shakespeare. He is just so enthralled to his own self-advancement and status. He's just drunk on his own supply that, yeah, he will on a regular basis say important things, but it will be so much diluted then by his addiction to his own supply that unfortunately he's not reaching his potential. Richard Spencer, again, someone just totally enthralled to his own supply. I'm sure there are some other figures. I think Peter Brimlow has done some formidable work with regard to immigration. You'd have to name some figures, and then I could react. But I can't think of anyone else. Saylor and Kofnas would be my two favorites.
Yeah. So what about Nick Fuentes, the Groypers?
I think he is the equivalent of the website Goop. It's just moronic. Now he's gifted. He is charismatic. He does have a gift of the gab, but he uses his skills frequently in a self-destructive and antisocial manner. I mean, he was against Donald Trump in the latest election because Trump didn't live up to his purity tests. So for all these gifts, his net contribution seems to be substantially antisocial. And I just can't imagine that anyone thoughtful would consider him someone who optimizes for truth. He clearly optimizes for attention.
Yeah, so if the initial alt-right, Luke, was born out of people wanting, I know, immigration restrictionism and a rolling back of social justice warriorness and a right to self-determination and this kind of stuff, what do you think the current remnants of like the dissident right want? What do you think it is that Nick Fuentes, Keith Woods, these people on the internet who are the modern day dissident right want?
I think they primarily want attention and a feeling of importance, just like I think almost everybody wants attention. It's that there are some admirable people who are willing to sacrifice a feeling of importance to do the right thing, that they put other values. So for some people, they will put the precepts of their religion ahead of their own desires for a feeling of importance. But overwhelmingly, the dissident right figures that you mentioned are just primarily out for themselves. And I just don't see examples where Nick Fuentes sacrifices on behalf of a principle greater than his own feeling of importance. I mean,
Yeah.
can you think of some examples where, for example, Nick Fuentes says he's a Christian. So if he is a Christian, then he would have to sacrifice some things that he wants to say, wants to do, due to the precepts of his religion. And I can't think of any examples where Nick Fuentes sacrifices on behalf of his religion. For example, I do not live stream on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays. I would not partake in these things even if they were to give me $1 million, because there are things that are more important to me than my importance and my income. And so that's a sacrifice that I make on behalf of the precepts of my religion, because there are things that I consider more important than my own desire to feel important, to feel like a big shot. And I am willing to follow the truth. Say, let's take the lab leak theory. So the dissident perspective on lab leak was that the coronavirus came from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. On the other hand, virtually all virologists, so virtually all those with expertise in virology, say that the lab leak was not the cause of COVID. So the pundits and the chattering class almost universally say lab leak was the cause of COVID, but virtually all those with expertise say it was not the cause of COVID. And so the audience wants to hear that lab leak was the cause of COVID, because then they can blame the experts and they can feel strengthened in their opinion that the system is out to get them, that the system's holding them back, the system is screwing them over, that you can't trust the experts. There's tremendous emotional comfort and resonance in believing that a lab leak was the cause of the coronavirus. And that feels really good. So as someone who optimizes for truth, I cannot promote something unabashedly just because my audience wants to hear it, without simultaneously, if I optimizing for truth, say, and yet all the experts say this is not true. And it is possible sometimes all the experts are wrong, but if one is putting a priority on truth, then you have to say, well, on the other hand, all the experts, all the virologists say that lab leak was not the cause of COVID. And there is a huge expert versus lay divide on the origins of COVID.
Yeah, but I mean, you almost hit it upon it yourself, Luke. All the experts say that like there's no differences between groups, and so this is where we're at on the dissident right. That all these people have been lied to so much by this thing that they've discovered is not true. Today, to this very day, all the experts tell us that evolution stopped at the neck. Basically, there's no difference between men and women. There's no difference between races. Different people don't have different gifts. So they know inherently that experts, just relying upon experts, can be wrong.
Right, but experts don't say that. So people with expertise in intelligence recognize that different groups have different levels of IQ, and experts in the origins of human evolution recognize that different groups evolved in different environments to be suited to those particular environments and therefore come into the modern world with different gifts. And so those with the most expertise do not deny that different groups have different gifts. It's those who proclaim themselves experts but don't actually have the expertise who are saying the things that you just said.
So why is the consensus that we can't talk about these things?
Because it is possible that there is some things that are true, but that right now might cause more problems, or it's just a suicide mission to talk about them for people who have something to lose. So if you're a professor with expertise in these areas, you might be strongly incentivized to water down or to not make explicit these obvious truths, right? You shouldn't expect people to run into machine gun fire. And so if social suicide is the result of talking about obvious truths, then we shouldn't be too dismayed that people aren't willing to commit social suicide.
Right. And what about immigration and immigration restrictionism, the negative effects of immigration? Would you say that these are self-evident?
Yes, I would say that these are self-evident, and in certain contexts, even the left will recognize that. So the New York Times, after Donald Trump's election, came out with a very in-depth article about how Joe Biden's immigration policy was an absolute disaster. And so you'll find people on the left who will admit that America's broken immigration process is a huge problem, and that the United States needs to get a handle on illegal immigration if we're going to have a more cohesive, coherent, trusting society. So there are people who will make that case from the camp of the experts.
To what extent do you think that we're ever going to make this case be the accepted norms? Do you see any future in the current aims of, basically the dissident right is a group of people who, if you take them at face value, they want to, secure Western countries for, to be majority demographically Western people, white countries for white people, basically. This is the remnants of the alt-right. This is where the dissident right supposedly is at. They want to save Western civilization. They believe that means stopping the demographic collapse of Western societies. Do you think we're ever going to mainstream this position?
It's hard to see that occurring, but we may see the intensity of the opposition diminish. We may see more voices on behalf of maintaining a coherent, cohesive, and more homogeneous society. So in the 1840s and 50s, the idea that communism would become the dominant governing system was unfathomable, and yet communism did become the dominant governing system for billions of people. So it may change, right? But it's hard to see that occurring right now. There doesn't seem to be a basis for believing that right now.
Okay. Now I want to ask you a few, tricky, difficult, whatever questions about Jews and their influence in the alt-right. So Jews have had an interesting arrangement with, or an interesting association with the alt-right from the very start, for good and for bad, in various people's opinions. I once remember Glib Medley in your chat saying, in answer to this question, why are there so many Jews in the alt-right? The answer to this question to Glib was, this is where the intellectual activity is, therefore Jews appear. I always thought that was an interesting answer. What is your hot take on the association of Jews in the alt-right? Are they actually interested in immigration restrictionism? Or is it, like many people suspected in the alt-right, that they just wanted to get control of the alt-right and steer it in a kosher direction? What are your thoughts on all this?
So for highly charged topics like this, it's often useful to change the category of people and then see how we would think about it. So let's initially replace Jews with Episcopalians. And so then we could talk about why are Episcopalians so interested in the alt-right? And you'd say, to begin with, 99% of Episcopalians are not particularly interested or supportive of the alt-right, but there are, say, 1% of Episcopalians who are interested in the alt-right and want to steer it in certain directions that are more pro-social, because Episcopalians tend to be successful people. They tend to have high IQs, around 110, right? Episcopalians and Jews tend to have about the same average IQ. And Episcopalians tend to be in the more successful end of society. And so they will tend to have more to lose. And so they will be a little less interested in burning everything down than people with nothing to lose. But Episcopalians who are intellectually alive and who enjoyed the comedy and the expansion of the Overton window in the dissident right will welcome that. And then simultaneously, when they see that movement heading in a destructive direction, they'll say it's heading in a destructive direction. So it's hard for me to see any difference in the way that Episcopalians engage in the alt-right and the way that Jews engage in the alt-right. So when 15 different Episcopalians become prominent online members, if not of the alt-right, but being interested in the alt-right, does that really say that much about Episcopalians and the alt-right? It's 15 individuals who happen to be Episcopalian, people with way above average IQ are interested in intellectual matters. They delve into this community. And so perhaps that's the same with Jews. I can't think, just off the top of my head, I haven't thought, not sure how deeply I've developed this idea before. I can't consciously remember doing it. I can't think of any difference between Jews and the alt-right and Episcopalians and the alt-right. Most Episcopalians are not alt-right. Most Episcopalians hate the alt-right to the extent that they know anything about it. So most Jews are not alt-right. Most Jews would have a negative view of the alt-right, but there are some fringe Episcopalians and some fringe Jews who do not instinctively hate the alt-right. I can't think of any Jews who saw themselves as leading members of the alt-right or who identify with the alt-right. It's more that you had some Jews who had sympathy with large swaths of the alt-right, but I can't think of any prominent Jews seeing themselves as leaders of the alt-right, and I can't think of any prominent Episcopalians who saw themselves as leading lights of the alt-right. Let's keep thinking this through aloud. Do you have like some follow-ups to help us develop this line of thought?
What I do, I bring in Durid, who says, look, he's basically saying, look, you're obfuscating. You're carrying water for Jews. The charges against, the questions about Jews in the alt-right have often been that they want to push back against anti-multiculturalism because it's basically in their own interest. And they're pro-immigration. Jewish organizations are pro-immigration, and so they have an interest in either defeating the alt-right, either defeating the dissident right, or diverting it into a more kosher kind of nationalistic impulse.
And how is that any different from Episcopalians? Most Episcopalians are pro-diversity. Most Episcopalians are on the left. Most Episcopalians vote for left-wing parties. Most Episcopalians want civil rights. They favor left-wing political solutions for society. I don't see any difference there between Episcopalians and Jews. And then put Duvid in context. What gives Duvid fame and positive comments? What brings him compliments and fame to the extent that Duvid gets compliments and fame?
It is going online and admitting that Jews are against white identity, basically.
Right. He expresses his prominence and fame. It comes from expressing empathy and sympathy for alt-right critiques of Jews.
Yeah, he's been described as the alt-right rabbi.
Right. So when someone's fame and sustenance, emotional sustenance and compliments comes from expressing sympathy and empathy for a group, then they're strongly incentivized to do so. But I just don't see any difference, again, but just taking the logic and empirical nature of his argument, I just don't see any difference between Jews and Episcopalians. I mean, there may be substantial differences here, but I just don't see them yet.
Okay, I get it. I don't know much about Episcopalians. What I do know, though...
That's Church of England. So what's called Episcopalians in the United States is called Anglicans in Australia and is called Church of England. So your Church of England elites in the United Kingdom, are they generally left of center? They certainly seem to be left of center.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Just in Welby.
So there are surely some prominent people whose religion is Church of England, right? Most people in the United Kingdom, if they have to identify with religion, they'll identify with Church of England, even if they don't go to church at all. So there are some people who identify C of E, Church of England, who are sympathetic or even proponents of the alt-right, but it doesn't really say anything about the Church of England, because the Church of England as an organization and as a religion and a group is certainly anti-alt-right. So, and same with Jews. To the extent that Jews are organized and a coherent people, they are opposed to the extreme right and generally opposed to communists as well.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, what I was going to say is that I absolutely take the argument that, you know, Gentile religious institutions are just as harmful in terms of speeding up the demographic replacement of Western societies, as others. So, like, I see in America Catholic organizations all across America, bringing in refugees from the southern border and things like that. In fact, when there was that refugee caravan, it was Catholic buses that were down there. They had Catholic organizations on the side, bringing in these people. And I've only ever heard the alt-right talk about that. It's like that Jewish organization, Hayas. So absolutely, I take your point 100%. To what extent, then, do you think that Jews could ever get on board, though, with immigration restrictionism? Because there's definitely they have, what am I trying to say? Unlike Episcopalians, Jews have a history of being immigrants into Western nations, and so they have this story that is inherent to them, and so people see this as an inherent contradiction that they could ever potentially, as a group, be allied with the idea of restricting immigration. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the same as Episcopalians. I would assume that Jared Taylor and Peter Brimlow are culturally Episcopalian, the equivalent of Church of England, and they're on board with immigration restriction. The most prominent proponents of immigration restriction are Jews. Nobody has done more for immigration restriction than Stephen Miller, and he's Jewish. And so even though most Jews are not actively immigration restriction, the most prominent immigration restrictionists are Jews. And so Jews in Israel who vote for the right wing, right, they are immigration restrictionists. They don't want illegal immigrants. And Jews in America who vote for the right wing are also immigration restrictionists. So the most rabid Zionists in the United States, the most radical, rabid, intense Jewish Zionists in the United States are immigration restrictionists. And they're immigration restrictionists for America and for Israel. And those Jews who oppose immigration restriction in the United States they also oppose immigration restriction by and large in Israel. And so the Ashkenazi elite in Israel tend to be left of center and opposed to Bibi Netanyahu and immigration restriction. And the Ashkenazi elite in the United States tends to be left of center and opposed to immigration restriction. And yet, the most elite and successful members of immigration restriction, both in Israel and in the United States, are also Ashkenazi Jews. So most American Jews, probably over 90%, are Ashkenazi. But in Israel, Ashkenazi Jews are probably only about 40 to 50% of the overall Jewish population, and therefore about 30 to 35% of the overall Israeli population. So the votes for Bibi Netanyahu primarily come from Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. But different groups, right, experience the world differently, and different physiological and brain structured groups experience the world differently. And so the left of center impulse is much more towards open borders, and the right wing impulse is much more with regard to suspicion of outgroups. And so right wing parties in Europe have almost uniformly been anti-Jewish for 200 years, right? The monarchy and the church have been the primary right-wing forces in Europe over the past 200 years. They've tended to be the most anti-Jewish. And so we should never expect Jews to join movements that are explicitly anti-Jewish. But as these right-wing forces in Europe have turned down their explicit anti-Jewish animus, you find an increasing number of Jews siding with them. So Marine Le Pen and the AfD in Germany have growing levels of Jewish support.
Yeah, okay. Don't you think, right, that in that multiculturalism, in a way, threatens like Jews remaining like at the top of American society more than anything, in a weird way? Like for, I don't know, the last 50, 60, 70 years or whatever, Jews have had a great place at the top of American society. They were basically welcomed in. They managed to set up, they climbed to the top of many institutions and created Hollywood, effectively have basically been put on a pedestal by American society in many different ways. Things have never been so good for Jews in America, and yet all that is like put under threat with America looking out into the future with its demographics trending downwards for white people who basically worship and love Jews in the main, in a large extent. All that is really under threat. Why? What I'm asking is, shouldn't like Jews and whites just like join together and protect America's current demographics from going away?
Okay, so most white people in the United States and Great Britain do not primarily identify as white. So people will primarily identify by their profession. They will primarily identify by religion. They will primarily identify as Americans or as English. Not many people in the United States and England primarily identify as white, and so too with Jewish identity. For most Jews in America, being Jewish is not their primary identity. Their primary identity is being American. If their primary identity was being Jewish, they would move to Israel. So the foundation of your question, I think, betrays an ignorance of the different levels of how people create an identity. Now, multiculturalism benefits minority groups such as Jews and, say, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, to the extent that multiculturalism means that you can't explicitly be held out of power or held out of elite university admissions on the basis of your race. So if multiculturalism means a meritocratic society, that's obviously really good for Jewish Americans and for Chinese Americans and for Japanese Americans. Now, multiculturalism has morphed into a more woke perspective, whereby you have increasing affirmative action for certain groups, which means restriction on a meritocratic society, and then that is not as obviously a benefit for Jewish Americans and Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans. So most Jews favor a meritocratic society. Most Jews do not favor exorbitant income tax rates and capital gains rates. And so Jews, by and large, don't like affirmative action. And so Jews are shifting, particularly among younger Jews, increasingly away from the Democratic Party towards either independents or towards Republicans. So it depends on what you mean by multiculturalism. So Jews on the right and Americans on the right favor more law enforcement, more immigration restriction, and more meritocracy. So there's really no difference, to the extent that I can see it right now, between Episcopalian reactions to multiculturalism and Jewish reactions. It depends on what is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism used to mean a meritocratic society. Multiculturalism has come to mean a less meritocratic society. Jews overwhelmingly favor a meritocratic society, and I suspect that Episcopalians, by and large, favor a meritocratic society, and that the meritocratic society is now anti-multicultural.
Would you agree that Jews run Hollywood?
I would agree that, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay.
So last time I checked, all eight of the major movie studios were run by Jews. So to the extent that I'm aware, I would say that Jewish individuals run Hollywood, and that there's a very strong Jewish influence, and that these Jews tend to be left of center.
Yeah, in fact, like Hollywood is basically a Jewish creation from the very beginning. It's like Jewish cinema in what it's evolved today. It's like Jews are great at storytelling, and Jews run Hollywood to this day. Would you say that Hollywood is, massive influencer of culture in America?
No,
it's not a culture creator.
Yeah, it's a massive influence, and it is a culture creator. But people did not evolve to be gullible. Right? People are not going to change their fundamental self-interested perceptions of reality on the basis of a great movie or a great TV show. So the propaganda regimes of the Nazis, the Soviet communists, and the Chinese communists didn't change minds. And Hollywood is not changing minds on people's basic self-interested perceptions of reality. So education, the educational industrial complex is overwhelmingly left of center, and yet people elected Donald Trump twice, Ronald Reagan twice, Richard Nixon twice, and George W. Bush twice. So if having major institution like our schools in the hands of the left was molding people, then you wouldn't expect Republicans to have any chance, and yet Republicans do just fine in elections. So the understanding that we did not evolve to be gullible just really cuts through the BS of so many lazy cultural political perspectives that people are just basically idiots who are moved by whatever the media tells them.
Yeah, I think this is one point I've always disagreed with you on. I agree people didn't evolve to be gullible, but I think when you talk to normies, their opinions really are not their own. I mean, to what extent are our opinions our own? Are we just like reflecting the things that we hear, the things that we absorb? But this is more obvious with normies. They just like repeat back these slogans, and you can like recognize it immediately. Wow, that's not even your own opinion. It's just like you can tell like where they've got it from the box that they've been watching in the room. So my wider point was, look, Jews control Hollywood, run Hollywood. Why don't Jews just like join forces with whatever, Episcopalians, Luke? Why don't they join forces together, Jews and Episcopalians, and agree to that the loss of America demographically will be bad for all of us?
Well, the type of people who are attracted to the arts are people who are cognitively and physiologically different from you and me. They are more open to new experiences, trying new restaurants, trying new ways of doing things. They are lower in conscientiousness in general compared to conservatives, and this type of personality is not usually congenial to immigration restriction. And let's go back to the basis for your point. You point out that most people's views on politics and culture are not their own. And that's 100% true, because it has nothing to do with your own success in life, whatever opinion you utter on politics, because you as an individual will make no difference in the politics and the culture of a nation. There is no rational, empirical, evolutionary reason why you need to have any particular opinion on political and cultural issues. So people will just say that which won't get them in trouble, or which something they've heard, but it has nothing to do with their own vital interest. What's a person's vital interest is who they marry and what type of work they go into, and how they maintain their income and how they spend their time. So all the questions that we're talking about makes no evolutionary difference to the lives of 99.999% of people. We talk about these things because they're fun for us. But whatever opinion people may have on these topics will not make any difference with regard to their ability to reproduce and to continue a particular evolutionary lineage.
So you don't think there's any way in which Jews collectively think about their future in America, and that manifests itself into their politics?
Of course, different groups have different ways of experiencing reality. So I grew up a Protestant and I converted to Orthodox Judaism. And there are significant cultural differences between Jews and Protestants. For one thing, Jewish parents invest more in their kids, and they have more intense, emotionally intense, financially intense. They have more intense relationships with their children. Jewish parents and ethnic parents are far more likely to live through their kids than Protestant parents. By and large, Protestants do not live through their children. And so Protestants tend to be much more individualist, and Jews tend to have stronger, tighter families, at least to the extent that the Jews maintain traditional ways. Another difference between Jewish culture and Protestant culture is that Jews are much more raw and open about the natural passions, such as for sex, for honor, for money. So it was considered bad form to want honor, to want fame, to want money, to want success, and just wearing that on your sleeve was just not on in Protestant circles. You had to disguise these primal passions. Jews feel much more open about talking about these primal passions. So there's much more emotional intensity among Jews. Mm-hmm. There is much more emotional openness among Jews. There is a much higher commitment and investment in family. So parents invest more in their kids, and in response, they feel entitled to ask more from their children than your typical Protestant family. Also, Jewish life tends to put a higher premium on success. So in Protestant life, if you come back with, say, a B average on your report card, and you tell your parents that you did your best and they believe you, that's fine. Well, for most North Asian families, all right, that's not usually considered okay to just do your best and get a B. And for a large number of Jewish families, that's not okay. So Jewish families put a higher premium on success than Protestant families, where if you just do your best, that's considered perfectly acceptable. And there is a higher value placed on earning. So to live as a Jew is very expensive. You have to have kosher food. You have to live close to walking distance of a synagogue. And Jewish communities have real estate that costs a lot more money. And so there is a higher emphasis on earning and on success and on marrying young and having children in Jewish life compared to Protestant life. So there are significant differences between Jewish culture and Protestant culture, and in many cases, Jewish culture has more in common with, say, Japanese American culture and Korean American culture and Chinese American culture. So different groups do experience the world differently. They do have different priorities. And so, for example, Asian Americans shifted significantly to the right. So Asian Americans initially benefited from a multicultural society in that it removed explicit barriers to, first of all, them becoming citizens of the United States and then achieving success in the United States. But when multiculturalism became affirmative action, that has worked to the detriment of Asian Americans. And so now Asian Americans are increasingly a formidable force against woke left-wing policies. So by and large, Jews and Asian Americans want a meritocratic society, and they will respond against those forces that oppose the meritocratic society. So tell me again, what was your question?
Well, I guess I basically am asking this question that David puts up here. Why don't Jews just team up with white European interests and realize that if America goes down, if the current ruling demographic of America is lost, then we all lose, and it's to our all. It's our own. To our own. It's like the scorpion and the frog in a weird way. We're going to go down together, and Jews have never had it so good in America, and yet they're teaming up with Episcopalians to bring in, the third world and ruin it for us all.
Well, how many Episcopalians who graduate from Harvard would feel comfortable talking about white interests? You're talking about fewer than 1%. As soon as you start talking about white interests, you immediately show yourself to be a barbarian and to be antisocial, and you will conjure up in people's minds a terrorist. And so virtually no educated, successful white people will discuss white interests, and Jews are even more educated and more successful on average than your average non-Jewish white American. So why on earth would Jews start talking in language that conjures up in most people's minds terrorism and Nazism, when white people won't even do it? White people won't talk about white interests.
It doesn't have to be Nazism. I mean, that's where the alt-right's gone wrong, leaning into Nazism. Everybody who's serious on the alt-right about realizing where the demographic collapse has come, they're not the ones goose-stepping in the streets, acting as neo-Nazis. We often wonder, who the heck are these people? Why are they doing that? These are the psyops, or these are the retards. Nobody wants that kind of stuff. But the serious people who look ahead and realize, my God, demographics are going off a cliff. We're importing the third world. This can't continue because we're going, this can't continue, and something is going to have to be done about it. Unless we're just giving up, that our current status in society, something has to be done. So,
well, why aren't Episcopalians talking about Episcopalian interests?
I've agreed with you. I'm saying that we're teaming up together. We're basically teaming up together like the scorpion and the frog to go down together in the river.
Well, people don't experience reality in the terms that you're talking about. Donald Trump ran a successful campaign. And
Jews are smarter than the rest of us, Luke. So the onus is on them to realize. How about that? Ashkenazis are very smart people, and so the onus is on them that they should look at and figure this shit out and come to this a sane conclusion that we can't keep on this course, and we have to do something about it. We have immense cultural power. We run these industries. Why are we teaming up together with Episcopalians to sink the ship?
Well, Ashkenazi Jews don't have a higher average IQ than Episcopalians. They're both about the same. So why aren't Episcopalians discussing this? So people experience the world differently, not in the terms that you expressed. people experience the world, Americans primarily experience the world in terms of being an American, and Americans have voted for immigration restriction 2 of the last 3 elections, right? The American people voted for Republicans in the House of Representatives by 3 percentage points over Democrats. So even though due to gerrymandering, Republicans only have like a 5-seat majority, which will effectively be reduced to a 2-seat majority. But in 2016, they won the House of Representatives with less than 1% of the national vote, by something like 0.6% of the national vote, but they got the equivalent of a 30-seat majority. So there's a majority of Americans who are voting for immigration restriction. And Donald Trump was initially inept at enacting his immigration restriction agenda, but he became steadily more and more adept, meaning that Stephen Miller, the guy in charge of his immigration agenda, became steadily more and more adept. And by 2020, he'd crushed immigration, both legal and illegal. And I think there's reason for optimism that in the second Trump term, he will crush immigration. But framing it in terms of white interests is simply not how overwhelmingly Americans experience reality. They experience reality in terms of being an American.
It doesn't matter how they experience it, though, in their own minds, does it? The demographic catastrophe remains what it is. So whether they care about it or not in their minds doesn't affect the fact that we are going to be minorities in our own countries, and this is like unprecedented.
Yeah, but you're buying into moronic level argumentation. So the people who make the argument, I'll tell you, because this is how the U.S. Census works. I am 1/16th Chinese. So if I click on my census form that I am Asian and I am Caucasian, I only count as Asian in the census. So the census is rigged in a way that dramatically overstates the number of blacks, Latinos, Asians, Middle Easterners, everyone but white. It dramatically overstates it. So the problem is not even the problem. So
I've got some pushback on that for you, because the white category also includes North Africans, Jews, Arabs. So the white category isn't even white either. So,
but even if you, so first of all, most of the people that you just talked about, North Africans and Jews, effectively consider themselves white. Most Jews, overwhelmingly 95% of Jews, consider themselves white. And when you look at the demographics, it's disproportionately slanted in the direction of overstating the percentage of blacks, Latinos, and Asians, even with that proviso, because someone like me who's 1/16th Asian, I would count solely as Asian in the U.S. Census.
Right, well, even if I gave it to you that it wasn't a problem in America, which I struggle to believe that, but even if I gave it to you, here in the UK, we know that something like 55%, the numbers just got to 55% of births in the UK are to people of foreign extraction. That means that in one generation, a couple of generations, the country is going to be minimum 55% of foreign extraction. So,
right, it's a problem, and there's an immigration problem in America and in the United Kingdom, but the catastrophic perspective is usually, certainly I don't know how what the UK equivalent of the census is constituted, but that people will base their lives on faulty understanding of the U.S. Census just shows how shallow this type of thinking is. I'm unaware of anyone in the dissident right or in the alt-right who shows any familiarity with how the U.S. Census is drawn up. And so this basic level of ignorance does not speak well of the truth quotient of their argumentation.
Are you honestly saying that fear about immigration and demographic collapse is alarmist?
No, I'm saying that the arguments that you are echoing there are usually alarmist. So the quote unquote white percentage of the population is not dropping nearly as precipitously as the as many people on the alt-right claim, because they don't understand how the US census is made.
Well, certainly here in the UK, we're bringing in 1 million people a year, and our birth rates are 1.44. Those birth rates actually include a lot of Pakistanis and a lot of various other cultures from outside. So probably the actual English birth rate is like 1.0. So for every 200 people, 100 couples, ethnically English people are probably halving per generation if it's 1.0. And we're bringing in 1 million people a year. This to me looks unmistakably like a demographic collapse. I don't think there could be any more. I don't think the situation could ever be more urgent, and describing it as alarmist just sounds crazy to me.
Well, I don't know enough details on UK, but let's say out of those million, let's say that 500,000 of half of them were from were white people. Would that affect you in any way? Or 90% of them? If they were 90% white or 50% white, how would you feel about that?
I mean, I still wouldn't be happy about it.
Right.
It'd be less. Look, I'll just be honest. It'd be less egregious because the bigger the difference between people, the harder it is for us all to get along. Currently, it's lots of African people fresh off a boat who don't speak a word of English. There's like unprecedented what we're seeing here in the UK. It's so different, so difficult to even interact with one another.
So if you had co-workers who were African migrants to the United Kingdom and were right-wing in their politics, who favored, say, a complete shutdown of immigration to the United Kingdom, who favored a complete end to affirmative action, who favored very strict law enforcement, who favored the return of capital punishment, who favored long prison sentences, who aligned with you on most political issues, would you feel more at ease with them or with white people who are woke?
Well, I usually avoid hypotheticals because they're so wildly unrealistic that they have to be a hypothetical. What you're saying just doesn't exist, really.
Well, the leader of the Tory party is black. I don't know where she's from, but I don't know how effective a political leader is. So it's not really a hypothetical. Have you watched the TV show Industry?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so it's largely people of color, most of the characters on the show, and about half of them are quite right-wing in their politics. And a majority of Latino men voted for Donald Trump. So the outline of what I was suggesting to you, it's not hypothetical. It exists all around you, that you will find plenty of people of color who are more aligned with your understanding of reality and of life than the white people around you, who may very well be much more towards the left. So race is just one thing that we have in common. So for many people, their primary identity is their profession. So let's imagine a world where you became a successful TV host of a chat show. Your primary identity would probably be TV personality. And you would probably feel most comfortable socializing with other people in that industry. Let's say that you have a dramatic religious conversion and you become a born-again Christian. Your primary identity would then become born-again Christian. So people have multiple identities, and it's not inevitable, and it's not usually true that their number one identity is racial. So people usually have a national identity, a local identity, a professional identity, a religious and ethnic identity. And so the more you have in common with other people, the better. But it just doesn't only boil down to race. There are other factors in people's identity.
Have you heard the term revert to type?
Yes.
Okay, so what I saw when the Black Lives Matter thing happened, Luke, here, in our country. I mean, it wasn't even something that happened in our country. It was a reaction to the George Floyd thing. But what I saw was our community of that demographic take to the streets, go crazy. Ethnicity suddenly trumped every other aspect of their identity. They reverted effectively to type and became, identity first people with grievances to bear. And so, simply put, what I don't want for my grandchildren, effectively looking out to the future, what I fear the most is that like my grandchildren will be persecuted for the historic crimes of white supremacy in my own country.
And what percentage of the non-white population of the United Kingdom do you believe supported the Black Lives Matter riots?
Right, it's hard to say.
Well, it's probably not. There are probably polls, and I would suspect that a majority of them did not support the riots, just like a majority of the white population did not support the white anti-immigrant riots of a few months ago.
Yeah, but that didn't stop them. That didn't stop them rioting. That didn't stop them largely getting away with it. Zero prosecutions for any of it. This is what's led to claims of a two-tier society in our country. Keir Starmer bending the knee, getting down on one knee. Police getting down on one knee in London to them, desecrating our statues, desecrating the cenotaph, the Winston Churchill statue. All of this going on in our own country, and like I say, so when you put the question to me, would I prefer living amongst?
I just said, would you feel more at ease with people of a different race who shared almost all of your outlook on life versus people of your race who disagreed with you about almost all of your outlook on life?
No, because I can see that a light switch can be flicked, and then all of a sudden, these people. They wear their skin suit. They wear their skin color as a uniform. That's what terrified me at the time.
But you don't really know what percentage of their group did those white rioters going up against police a few months ago. Did they enjoy the support of most white people in the United Kingdom? No, most people were horrified by what they did, and so too in the non-white population, most of them were horrified by the Black Lives Matter riots. Like people have multiple identities, and different identities will be triggered under different circumstances. But it's not like black identity is just the one thing that becomes inevitably the primary identity, while white identity just doesn't mean anything. It's all dependent on circumstances. So sometimes a person's religious identity will become primary if there's like a religious revival. Then other circumstances, their social class identity becomes primary. So you will see when England plays a match, right, you will see a ton of non-white English rabidly supporting England, right? Their English identity has been brought to the fore by a particular set of circumstances. So you think that there's just something inherent in blackness, something inherent in Pakistani identity, something inherent in, say, Muslim identity. But for all identities, it always expresses itself differently under different circumstances. So Jewish identity expresses itself differently in different circumstances. White identity expresses itself differently. Christian identity, Muslim identity. Like the genes that we have will display different phenotypes, will display differently in different circumstances. We all react to incentives and situations, and it's not like there's just some do you think that there's just an essential quality to black people that no matter the situation, this is who they are?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't agree with all X are like X. 100%. There's definitely good people.
No, forget good or bad. Black members of the United Kingdom will respond differently in different circumstances.
But we talked at the start about group differences, and so we're talking about like on averages. We're talking about how people. So some groups you would absolutely agree, are more likely to commit crimes.
the amount of crimes that they will commit will dramatically vary depending on circumstance. So the more law and order you have, those groups that are most prone to committing crime, young men, right, they will commit different amounts of crime depending on how strict surveillance we have and how strict law enforcement we have.
Yeah, you know, for instance, that like the meme 53 does 10 or whatever it is actually more like 85 does it. It's because it's actually a small group of males within that age bracket range that you speak of a particular group who do it. And so, yeah.
Right, men commit 10 to 20 times as much murder as women. And so, right, different groups have different propensities to violent crime. Right, you're 20 times more likely to be assaulted by a man than by a woman.
Sorry, I got it the wrong way around, by the way. It's 13 does 53. That's the meme I was speaking of. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. I don't need to explicitly say it. But it's actually more like... Well, anyway, we won't go there. But
okay, I just wanted to develop a point because the chat's saying Luke is just his incessant appeal to statistics is not a compelling argument. It's akin to saying not all Muslims. Not saying not all Muslims. I'm saying that there is not an essential quality to Muslim identity or Christian identity. There's not an essential quality to Jews, Muslims, black people, white people, Japanese. The expression of this identity will dramatically differ depending on circumstances. So Muslims are also becoming more secular. So Protestant Christians assimilated first to a secular life, and then Catholic Christians were slower to assimilate, but they also assimilate to a more secular outlook on life. And Muslims who moved to Europe, they are on a similar trajectory. They are increasingly becoming secular. And so Muslims are not immune from the culture around them. Jewish culture displays itself differently in the Roman Empire and the Spanish world 1,000 years ago, as opposed to the Pale of Russia in the 19th century, as opposed to the United States in the 21st century. So there's not an inherent maniacal terroristic quality to Muslims. There's not an inherent oppressive settler quality to white Europeans. There's no essential quality to any group. The group will display itself differently in different circumstances.
You know what a lot of people will tell me, right, when they listen to you speak? It's that whilst what you say could technically be true, may technically be true, it's kind of useless to be over-analytical in this way because it helps us not. So you might be right about whatever you're saying. This group does this, this group does that. These people aren't necessarily like this. X aren't necessarily like that. You can find all this, blah, blah, blah. You're being over... You're over altruistic in your analysis, and therefore it like leads to analysis paralysis and makes you unable to do what like the original alt-right was there for in the beginning, which is to identify the problem and work towards solving it.
Yeah, and look what happened to those who took those who have the perspective that you displayed destroyed themselves to the extent that they had a known identity. They became alienated from their family. They got fired from their jobs. They were expelled from their educational institutions. They have self-destructed those who have their identity. And what you just gave was the argument that people in authority when COVID happened said, we can't give nuance to COVID. We can't let people know how little we know. We can't let people know how arbitrary our decisions are. We have to boil down our public health instructions because they're going to be taken in by people of all different levels of IQ. And if we allow nuance, if we are open and honest and transparent with how little we know and how arbitrary our decisions are, then our advice will not be taken. And religious authorities have made the same arguments. That yes, what you're just saying now is true, but we can't say that truth to our parishioners because then they'll be less likely to observe Jewish law or to have faith in Jesus or to be a good Muslim. So people throughout history and throughout society make all sorts of arguments for why noble lies are good. And what you were just saying is, noble lies are good for the cause. And I would argue to you that a substantial amount of the time, noble lies are not good, and truth is better than lies. So that's where I stand. That's what I would say if you're a New York Times reporter calling me right now. And this is what I'd say to you and to the person who's watching. Truth is better than lies. And the upshot of what you were just arguing to me is that lies are better than truth. And I don't agree. I think truth, when it comes to public policy, is better than lies.
What I'd say is all these groups that we agree that agree. Well, let me rephrase. What I'd say is that the groups. What I'd say is that is that the problems we're talking about depend upon our inability to identify the problems, and so they play upon our unwillingness to be able to point it out and identify it and all get agreed upon what is the problem. So that's why there's so many different arguments for like immigration, and we can never realize what the actual problems are and come to a collective decision about whether it's good for us or not. And time is kind of running out, Luke.
And you're saying that we're headed for catastrophe and time's running out, and essentially we should persist with noble lies because we're in an emergency situation. We have no time for truth right now.
I don't know if I'd call it noble lies. I'd say be more... Basically, the alt-right was the ones willing to willing to dissent from this mainstream consensus where political correctness had overrun society and we were too polite to acknowledge problems in society. And that is what was useful about it. And if we lose that element of what was useful about it, because we're too eager to explain every which way about every single thing, then basically we're useless. We're spinning wheels. We're spinning our wheels, doing nothing.
Right. So this is the equivalent of appealing to the mafia to take care of a problem for you. Let's say your daughter's raped, and the criminal justice system gives you no satisfaction. So you go to the mafia and say, "Please, Godfather, give me satisfaction." And the Godfather says, "Well, you understand that if I take care of this matter for you, and I'm not going to kill the guy, but we will give you satisfaction, that you will then owe me." And that's underlying what you're saying, because I'm losing my train of thought here. So could you give me your point again in one sentence, and then I'll regain my thought?
The alt-right was useful.
Oh yes, I got it. So the alt-right was useful in that it was saying transgressive truths that people with something to lose would not admit. So the alt-right was performing a service to the extent that it was sharing truths that were not polite to admit. The price then is that you are then throwing in your lot with people overwhelmingly who have nothing to lose. So the people for whom it was easy to state transgressing truths had nothing to lose. And unfortunately, people who have nothing to lose have very little human capital. So you are overwhelmingly throwing in your lot with a bunch of self-destructive, antisocial losers, and you see that displaying itself again and again and again. So it's a wonderful thing when someone comes through for you. So let's say your neighbor does you a good turn, but then you're enthralled to him from then on, right? The mafia comes through for you and they give you satisfaction with regard to your daughter's rapist. But if you are then enthralled to the mafia for the rest of your life, and your family's enthralled to the mafia for the rest of your life, overall, it's a bad deal. And throwing in your lot with people with low human capital who are antisocial losers is a really bad deal, even if there are some positive things on their side. You really don't want to throw in with a bunch of losers.
Well, I can absolutely agree with that, and we both have the same opinion of the losers on the dissident right, the goose steppers, and all these people. Let me ask you this, Luke. I know we're coming up on like 2 hours, but let me ask you this: would it benefit Israel to not get wrapped up in noble lies about the Palestinians and to recognize the nuances about Palestinians and Arabs, and that, you know, not all Palestinians are bad people, and to change its ways so that they recognize the good in all people?
It would depend on the context. So if you're in a blind alley and you're fighting for your life against a Palestinian, you are not served by recognizing the good in your adversary if you're in a life and death struggle. And so if you, generic human being, are in a life and death struggle in a blind alley, and it's either you kill or you be killed, then understanding nuance does not serve you. However, if you're talking about public policy, then understanding nuance does serve you. So usually, for the sake of truth and clarity, taking things personally does not serve you. But if you're fighting for your life in a blind alley, or if you generally lack energy and enthusiasm to do the things that you need to do, then taking it personally will serve you, because it will give you more energy and it will help you deal with an immediate threat. So sometimes getting mad and displaying your anger will help you to accomplish something that you otherwise would not be able to accomplish. However, for every time that getting mad and displaying my anger serves me, there are 10 times that I've gotten mad and displayed my anger where it hasn't served me. So one needs to be really judicious in giving in to your anger. So fighting for your life, or simply developing the strength to take care of a problem, and you would not be able to take care of this problem effectively without getting mad, without taking it personally, then that serves you. But particularly if you're starting out from a place of social isolation and low human capital, following your base instincts will be a disaster 10, 20, 30 times for every instance that it serves you.
So it's probably in Israel's interest to engage in noble lies in the immediate term. Would you agree?
No, if it's an Israeli soldier fighting for his life in a back alley in Gaza, it does, but not for people who are composing policy. So let's say the Gaza situation, you have a bunch of terrorists attack you from Gaza and they kill about 1,000 of your citizens, and the only way to get control of this situation is to wipe out this terror group, which is going to mean a lot of dead civilians on the enemy side. I understand the pragmatic case for that, and I also understand recognizing that a lot of these dead civilians were innocent parties, and that this comes at a huge cost to Gazan civilians. But if I were a spokesman for Israel, I'd say that is the fault of the terror group that instigated this invasion. But I would also recognize, I would try to have clarity that there are various strategies. So Israel perhaps could abstain from invading Gaza and take steps that minimize civilian casualties, and thereby enjoy much more widespread international support. And there are good arguments for that strategy. So maintain international support that you received from so many of your own citizens being massacred, and engage in highly judicious strikes only against members of the terror organization, and doing everything you can to minimize civilian casualties. So I would want to be open-minded to that argument, and I'd want to be open-minded to experiencing the reality of life as Gazans experience it. I understand why Palestinians would support terror against Israel, because if Palestinians lived in peace, they would be outcompeted by the higher Israeli human capital on a dramatic basis. Think about how humiliating it must be to be an Egyptian, a Palestinian, a Jordanian, a Syrian, and a citizen of Lebanon, and seeing Israel thriving while your own country is about as backward and unproductive as any country on earth. Incredible humiliation. And so I understand why people would rather risk their lives and kill themselves in terror attacks against someone who is humiliatingly successful.
Yeah, Luke, we're about 2 hours. I think we'll come to an end. I appreciate the conversation. It's been interesting. It's been all over the place, but it's been very interesting. At the end of SJJMAS's, I've been asking people if they want to sing a song. Now, I don't know if there's any kosher song that you could sing for us tonight.
No, I'm sorry.
No.
This was a very challenging conversation. Not challenging.
Is there anything that you would have wanted me to ask you that I didn't ask you?
Yeah. Let me just finish this thought. So this was a challenging conversation, not to the extent that the ideas that I'm articulating were challenging, but a stranger that I might run into on the street may well encounter this YouTube. So the challenge was in framing what I have to say in the most socially acceptable manner,
Yes,
while minimizing the cost of truth. So when I optimize for truth, that doesn't mean that truth is my only consideration. My welfare is a higher consideration than truth. And so I try to frame everything I said while optimizing for truth, but my own welfare is more important. And so the challenge in answering your questions was not in the intellectual and truth element. It was in framing and expressing it in a way that was likely to do the least damage to my own well-being. And I would want this for anyone. I would not want anyone to self-destruct online, even if they are telling 100% the truth. So optimizing for truth is a very good value when talking about political, cultural issues. But for most people, most of the time, there's an even more important and higher value than that, and that is not sabotaging your life. And so if you speak out on uncomfortable, controversial issues, for most people, it's more important to them that they frame their responses primarily in terms of their own self-interest, and often that's more important than saying the truth.
Yes, no, I definitely appreciate that, and I hope it didn't put you in too much of an uncomfortable vice grip. I think
No, but it was a challenge. I'll admit. I'm fully alive, fully activated, and fully challenged. And that's a compliment to you.
Okay, that's cool. That's a good place to be. I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you very much. This has been SJJMAS number 25. Yes, Luke's links are in the description. Luke does his shows over on his main YouTube channel, and occasionally when he gets a strike on his backup channel, which is also linked there, and he uploads them, his main shows, as a podcast onto his backup channel as well. I came through the Luke Ford school of following the dissident right way back in the day, so I have a lot of appreciation for Luke, and I recommend you go and watch his show.
Thanks, mate. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Good night. Merry Christmas, everyone.